In the last lecture module, we noted that the intuitive judgments generated by the vignettes that Gettier and others use exploit a tension between the internalist perspective of the protagonist and the externalist perspective of the backstory. As a result, we wondered whether or not there could be Gettier-type cases for externalist theories like reliabilist theories of justification or knowledge. We noted that discrimination cases that are pretty prevalent in the literature, like the zebra case, seem to have a similar structure, and so we wanted to explore whether or not they in fact were Gettier cases for reliabilist theories. I want to use an example from Alvin Goldman's 1976 paper. Like Dredski's zebra example, it's a very early example of a discrimination case. I'll just read it verbatim, though I'm not going to include it in the slides. Henry is driving in the countryside with his son. For the boy's edification, Henry identifies various objects on the landscape as they come into view. That's a cow, says Henry. That's a tractor. That's a silo. That's a barn, etc. Henry has no doubt about the identity of these objects. In particular, he has no doubt that the last mentioned object is a barn, which indeed it is. Each of the identified objects has features characteristic of its type. Moreover, each object is fully in view. Henry has excellent eyesight, and he has enough time to look at them reasonably carefully since there is little traffic to distract him. So there we have our protagonist perspective being portrayed. Now we get a backstory. Suppose we are told that unknown to Henry, the district he has just entered is full of papier-mâché facsimiles of barns. These facsimiles look from the road exactly like barns, but they are really just facsimiles, facades, without back walls or interiors, quite incapable of being used as barns. They are so cleverly constructed that travelers invariably mistake them for barns. So at a superficial level, this discrimination case that Goldman presents in his paper looks exactly like a Gettier case. However, in order to argue for the insufficiency in discrimination cases, that is, that reliable processes are insufficient for knowledge, those cases have to generate the intuition that the process is reliable. As a result, theorists will often appeal to the protagonist's perspective, for instance, by specifying that the protagonist had no reason to suppose that the process's presuppositions had been violated, and so on. However, once we have adopted a reliable theory, and we are presented with an objective externalist description of the facts in the backstory, those facts aren't as easily discounted in generating our response to the vignette as they are otherwise. In these cases, it looks for all the world as though Henry, unbeknownst to him, has entered into a local area where the presuppositions of his visual barn recognition process have been violated, and it is no longer reliable. At least people generally don't have this strong intuition that Henry's barn identification is in fact obviously reliable. So appeals to the protagonist's perspective in order to try and bolster this intuition that the discrimination cases involve reliable belief-forming processes seems to potentially violate externalism. Externalists will often argue that discrimination cases, qua Gettier, apply only to perceived reliability accounts of knowledge and not to externalist versions of reliabilism. After all, the backstory explicitly tells us that the process isn't reliable in this particular locality. In response, critics will often then invoke the externalist perspective. They'll argue something along the lines that there are no objective markers for determining relevant cases and excluding irrelevant cases when evaluating the reliability of a process. For instance, Stein, in a 1976 paper, notes that it does leave a lot of things unsaid, that is, the reliabilist relevant alternatives response. What are normal circumstances? What makes an alternative relevant in one context and not in another? In ordinary life, we exhibit rather strong agreement about what's relevant and what is not, but there are gray areas. However, difficulties in determining how best to evaluate the reliability of a process, they pose a problem for reliabilism, but that problem is antithetical to the claim that it is intuitively clear in these cases that reliable processes are insufficient for knowledge. And in fact, many of the people who adopt discrimination cases adopt them precisely to argue that there is no clear-cut way of determining reliability in such circumstances. But even if I'm right about that, the sorts of examples that Gettier highlights in his paper seem to illustrate a fundamental tension in traditional epistemology between intuitions driven by internal and external perspectives, a tension between the aspiration to reason in accordance with one's conception of the evidence and the aspiration to be right for the right reasons. What remains unclear is whether the tools of traditional epistemology can resolve this tension, or even if such a resolution is possible either within traditional epistemology or by alternative means. Rather than try to answer that last question, what I want to do instead is finish this lecture module by reviewing some of the important features of traditional epistemology that have emerged during the course of the term. Remember that at the beginning of the term, I suggested that traditional epistemology formulates theories about knowledge that have the form of rigorous definitions. Specifically, epistemologists formulate theories that specify the individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for counting as an instance of knowledge. Thus, the most widely held definition of knowledge, as we've seen, is that knowledge is justified true belief. I also suggested that epistemologists tend to think about knowledge and formulate theories about knowledge in terms of isolated instances of individual belief formation. Less often, they think in terms of isolated instances of knowledge use. So, for instance, in the Theaetetus, we saw Plato thinking about knowledge primarily in terms of individually isolated uses of knowledge in perceptual categorization. I further claim that traditional epistemologists rarely expand their thinking about knowledge beyond the relatively abstract evidential relationships between beliefs in a larger knowledge edifice. So we found both coherentists and foundationalists like Descartes, when they thought about justification, they thought about it in terms of some small subset of inferential relationships between the specific belief that they were thinking about and other beliefs in their knowledge edifice. Finally, I want to note that the primary investigative methodology of epistemology consists in leveraging these intuitive categorization judgments regarding versions of this central metaphor, that is, regarding instances of single beliefs formed largely in isolation from potential uses and other aspects of the cognitive economy, and that these intuitive categorization judgments are expressed as reactions to vignettes expressing thought experiments. Now, alternative approaches exist in the literature, for instance, naturalized epistemology, though their promise remains somewhat unclear, in large part because they're widely mischaracterized and treated with suspicion.